Democrat means Marxist. The communists picked the name Social Democrat to appeal to the larger part of the population. The word propaganda should be taken to mean political advertising. The modern use of this word has negative connotations and is often associated inaccurately with brainwashing. This was not Hitler's intent when he used the word. The word propaganda is maintained wherever he used it, but the reader should keep in mind that it was describing a type of education for the people, and was not seen as something sinister or manipulative. The word bourgeois has also been replaced. A number of places Hitler refers to the bourgeois. This term is very uncommon in English-speaking countries, so it was updated to privileged class, which is reasonably accurate. Bourgeois, as used in Mein Kampf, means the social class that includes the wealthy, the employers, and aristocrats, but not those of royal birth. It can also describe people who make money through education or government service, which are considered to be socially above what we would call today the middle class, and above blue-collar workers, farmers, factory workers, day labourers, which are referred to as the proletariat or peasants or masses. This term, too, has been updated to use more accurate terms such as farmer or physical labourer, as appropriate for the context. Many German sentences become nonsense when directly translated to English. This was a serious problem in past translations. Critics often characterized Hitler as rambling based on these poor translations. For instance, a direct translation may start as, "So, if I thus soon became, however," which is clearly wordy in English, and such unnecessary complexity only confuses the reader. Some of the original German passages have 10 or more clauses in one sentence, and many sentences comprise entire paragraphs with only comma or semicolon separations. This complexity is a result of Hitler dictating his work and not writing it. This has contributed to the idea that Mein Kampf was poorly written. It is not meant to be a great novel, but a transcription of a very long speech. It is not meant to be a literary work, and it is also not fairly represented by past translations. We have also added clarifications. Any reference to people, places, things, or quotes which the modern reader may be unfamiliar with has been explained. Readers of past translations were left confused when obscure references were made to military theorists or to Greek stories or to places that had relevance to Germans but not to the rest of the world. All of those references are now explained in parentheses after the entry. For example, "My youthful enthusiasm for the master of Bayreuth," meaning the composer Wagner, "knew no bounds." The modern reader would not know who the master of Bayreuth was. The new Ford translation explains the background so any reader will understand what these otherwise confusing references mean. Previous translations use hundreds of uncommon words like propitious, excrescens, recalcitrant, or parvenu, which only obscure the meaning of the text. The new Ford translation uses common and clear words. There was no way to read and understand previous versions of Mein Kampf without a dictionary in one hand and Mein Kampf in the other. Before this translation was made, any true understanding was limited to college English professors. The inability to understand the text also caused many readers to dismiss the work as complex nonsense. However, the problem was in the past translations, not the original work. When making a translation, the translator's own beliefs can colour the choice of words. Does a certain passage about a group of people best translate as race, blood, people, nation, or ancestry? Some words have stronger connotations than others, and the meaning of the passage can be easily influenced by the translator's choice. Any or all may be technically correct as well. Older translations used words like populist or folkish when the real meaning was ethnic or race. This made the true meaning unclear because confusing and vague words were used. The words populist or folkish are generic, and the meaning depends on who uses them. In Hitler's case, they mean our people, our Teutonic people, our Aryan Germans, or our race. So the meaning of racial is more accurate than populist or folkish. The Ford translation uses the words race-based or racialist, which are more accurate translations of the original German word Völkisch. The word racist was not used because it has a negative modern connotation that was not Hitler's intention. His use of the word was meant to identify someone who makes decisions based on race and studies race-based issues, and was not intended to have any negative associations. You can find even more details about how words and phrases were translated to extract their true English meaning, plus learn more about Hitler's style in the e-book Mein Kampf, a translation controversy, which is available for free at www.hitlerlibrary.org. The new Ford translation has been heavily researched, and every line has been reviewed multiple times to verify it as accurate and true to the original German meaning as possible. Plus, it has been edited to make it as easy to understand as possible. No other translation of Mein Kampf has ever been produced which is this thorough or this easy to understand. Adolf Hitler's foreword. I began my sentence in the fortress of Landsberg on the Lech, April 1, 1924, resulting from my sentence handed down from the Munich People's Court. For the first time in my years of uninterrupted party work, I was finally able to begin a job that many had asked me to complete, and one which I myself felt was useful for the movement. I decided to write 2 volumes, which would not only explain the aims of our movement, but also would reveal the birth of the movement. I believe my story will be more beneficial than a simple historical description. This work will allow me to describe my own growth in the movement and assist in crushing the falsehoods about me created by the Jewish press. My writing is not for strangers, but for those heart-strong supporters of the movement and those whose minds need enlightenment. I know that men are more rarely won over by the written word than they are by the spoken word, and that every great movement in this world owes its growth to great speakers, not to great writers. Still, writing is necessary to create a unified doctrine we can distribute. I must lay down its principles for all time. These 2 volumes, then, are meant to serve as stones which I hereby add to the foundation of the movement. Adolf Hitler, the author, Landsberg on the Lech Prison Fortress. Mein Kampf, Volume 1, An Accounting. Chapter 1, Childhood Home. Today I am pleased that fate chose the city of Braunau am Inn of northern Austria as my birthplace. This little town is on the frontier of the 2 German states whose reunion, at least for those of us from the younger generation, will be the accomplishment of a lifetime. We must do everything we can to reunite these states. Austria must return to the great German mother country, not for economic reasons. No, the economics are unimportant. Even if it did not make economic sense, it must still take place because common blood belongs in one common realm. The German people have no moral right to set up remote colonies when they cannot even unite their own children in a common state. The people will only earn the right to acquire foreign soil when the Reich has expanded to include every German. The plough will become the sword, and the wheat, which becomes the bread of posterity, will be watered by the tears of war. Now, this little frontier city has become the symbol of a great undertaking, but it also has a past that we should take as a warning today. More than 100 years ago, this humble place had the privilege of being immortalized in German history as the scene of a tragedy which shook the whole German nation. It was the day of our fatherland's deepest humiliation, when the bookseller Johannes Palm, a citizen of Nuremberg, an unapologetic nationalist and hater of France, died for the Germany which he loved passionately, even in her time of misfortune.
Johannes Philipp Palm was a book dealer in Nuremberg, and in 1806 sold a pamphlet denouncing France titled Germany's Deepest Humiliation. but France previously invaded and was in control of Bavaria at that time. The Bavarian police chief turned him in. He refused to name the author, and Napoleon ordered Palm to be shot at Braunau am Inn, where Hitler was later born and where there is a monument to Palm.
Palm stubbornly refused to reveal the names of his fellows who believed as he did. He was very much like our Leo Schlageter.
Albert Leo Schlageter fought in the First World War, joined the Nazi Party in 1922, and committed acts of sabotage against the French occupation in Ruhr, was betrayed to the French, tried and executed by the French. He was viewed as a hero in the Nazi Party.
And like Schlageter, Palm was betrayed to France by a government representative. An Augsburg police director was responsible, and with this act laid down the framework that formed the modern disreputable official German government under the Reich of Mr. Severing.
Karl Wilhelm Severing was a Social Democrat official in the Weimar government controlling Germany at that time, who refused to make any effort to stop the execution of Schlageter.
This little city on the Inn was made golden as a result of the German martyrdom I mentioned, was German Bavarian by blood and Austrian only by borders. It is here my parents lived in the late 1880s. My father, a conscientious employee of the state as a customs official, and my mother occupied with the household, were both above all devoted to us children with unwavering love and care. I do not remember much from that period. After only a few years my father left the little frontier town he was so fond of, so he could take a new post at Passau in Germany itself. In those days Austrian customs official travelled frequently. So afterward my father went to Linz, where he was stationed for some time. This does not mean the old gentleman had a chance to rest. His family could be called very poor farmers, and even in his earliest days he had not lived in a happy home. Before he turned 13, the small boy packed his knapsack and ran away from his home in the mountainous section of Lower Austria. Against the advice of villagers, he chose to go to Vienna and learn a trade. This was back in the 1850s, so it was not a simple decision to travel into the unknown with only 3-crown coins. But by the time the 13-year-old turned 17, he had passed his journeyman's examination to be a cobbler, yet he had still not found contentment. To the contrary, the long period of economic problems back then, the unending misery and wretchedness he encountered, only strengthened his determination to give up his trade and become something better. When he was a poor boy in the village, he thought that the church pastor embodied the highest possible summit of human aspiration. However, his experience in the big city replaced this notion with the dignified possibility of becoming a state official. With the endurance of a man who has grown old through grief and distress, while still half a child, the 17-year-old mustered up his new determination and became a customs official. When he was almost 23, I believe, he decided that he had achieved the goal he set so long ago. The poor boy had once taken a vow not to return to his native village until he had become somebody. He had reached his goal, but when he returned, no one in the village remembered the little boy of years earlier. As he looked around, he found the village had grown strange to him. It was no longer the village he remembered from childhood. When he finally retired at 56, he could not stand to live a single day as a do-nothing, so he bought property in the neighbourhood of the Upper Austrian market town of Lambach, farmed it, and thus completed the circle of a long and hard-working life by returning to the point where his forefathers began. I believe it was around this time that my first ideals were forming. My constant romping around outdoors, taking the long road to school, and my association with extremely rowdy boys sometimes gravely worried my mother. It also kept me from being a stay-at-home soul. So the few serious ideas I had about my future certainly did not point towards my father's career. Even then, my gift for speaking was developing through more or less violent disputes with my playmates. I had somehow become a little ringleader among my group. I had no trouble learning and completing my lessons at school, but otherwise I was fairly hard to handle. In my free time, I had singing lessons at the Canons chapter in Lambach,
Catholic Church members.
and here I was dazzled by the dignified and magnificent church musical festivals. Just as my father had once looked upon the little village pastor, I now looked at the local religious leader as an ideal to aspire to. At least for a while this was the case. My father did not think very highly of his quarrelsome boy's vocal talents, and he did not see a future in the church for his offspring. He had no appreciation for such youthful ideas either. He must have watched anxiously as my nature clashed with my desires. My desire for that calling soon disappeared and was replaced by hopes that were better suited to my temperament. In rummaging through my father's library, I found various military books. There was a popular edition of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870–71. 2 volumes of an illustrated magazine from those years now became my favourite reading. It was not long before the great heroic battle had become my greatest spiritual experience. From then on, I became more and more enthusiastic over anything connected with war, or at least with being a soldier. This was important to me for another reason. For the first time, I was forced to ask myself if there was a difference between the Germans who fought these battles and the Germans around me. And if they were different, how were they different? Why did Austria not fight in the war? Why did my father and all the others in our city not fight? Were we not like all the other Germans? Did we not all belong together? This problem stirred my young brain for the first time. I learned that not every German was fortunate enough to belong to the Empire of Bismarck. I could not understand this at the time, so I began my studies. Based on my character and especially my temperament, my father decided that attending a classical secondary school,
Gymnasium or high school attended from age 10 to 18, which teaches in Greek or Latin classics but not vocational subjects,
would conflict with my personality. He thought a vocational school would be more suitable. His opinion was confirmed by my obvious ability to draw. That was a subject which he believed was neglected in the Austrian humanistic schools. Perhaps his own hard-working life made him think less of classical studies, which he considered impractical. Being a man of principle, he had already decided his son must, become a state employee. His own difficult youth naturally made his later accomplishments seem even greater, because they were the product of his own iron strength and ability. The pride of being a self-made man led him to want the same or better for his son. He believed his own hard work would make it easier for his child to succeed in the same field. My outright refusal to follow a career that had been his whole life was to him quite inconceivable. So my father's decision was simple, definite and clear, and, in his eyes, he had an obvious course of action. His lifetime struggle for existence had made him domineering, and he would have never left an important decision to a boy he saw as inexperienced. This would have seemed an unforgivable weakness in the exercise of his parental authority over his child's future. It was impossible for him to reconcile it with his concept of duty, and yet it was all destined to end differently. At the time I was barely 11, and for the first time in my life I was forced to oppose my father. Steadfast and determined as my father might be in carrying out the plans that were fixed in his mind, his son was no less stubborn and resistant in refusing this unappealing idea. I would not enter the civil service. Neither pleading nor reasoning with me had any effect on my resistance. I would not be an official. No, and again, no. Every attempt to arouse my interest in that calling through descriptions of my father's experience had the opposite effect. I yawned myself sick at the thought of sitting in a government office, not being the master of my own life, but a slave devoting my entire existence to filling out various forms. What effect could this possibly have on a young boy who was anything but good in the ordinary sense? I did my schoolwork with ridiculous ease, and had so much free time left that I was outdoors more than in. Today, when my political opponents scrutinize my life with such loving care, searching back even into my childhood for the satisfaction of uncovering some piece of deviltry this fellow Hitler was up to in his youth, I thank heaven for them, giving me a few more memories of that happy time. Field and forest were the battleground where my constantly recurring differences in opinion were settled. Even the attendance at secondary school, which followed, did little to restrain me. But now another dispute had to be fought out. So long as my father's intention to make me into an official clashed only with my general dislike of the career itself, the conflict was quite tolerable. I could withhold my private views, and I did not have to make a constant issue of them. My own determination never to become an official was enough to give me an inner calm. I clung to this determination firmly. The situation was more difficult when I developed a plan of my own that opposed my father. This happened when I was still only 12. I cannot recall how it happened, but one day it was clear to me that I would be a painter, an artist. My talent for drawing had been clearly demonstrated, and in fact it was one of my father's reasons for sending me to a secondary school. However, he would never consider giving me professional art training. On the contrary, when I rejected my father's pet idea once again, he asked me for the first time what I myself wanted to be. Without thinking, suddenly my decision popped out. It was clear my choice had already been firmly planted and would not be changed, and for a moment my father was speechless. A painter? An artist? He doubted my sanity, and then thought perhaps he had not understood correctly. But when I explained it to him, and he saw I was serious, he was against it completely. Any talents I might have were simply beyond his consideration. An artist, never, not so long as I live. But since his son had inherited, among various other qualities, a stubbornness like his own, my answer was equally stubborn. Both sides stuck to their guns. My father held to his never, and I redoubled my nevertheless. The result was not pleasant. The old gentleman was embittered, and though I loved him, I was equally bitter. My father forbade me even to hope that I would study painting. I went a step further and declared that, in that case, I would not learn anything more. Of course, I came in second with such a declaration, since the old gentleman began ruthlessly to assert his authority. I then learned to keep silent in the future, but I did carry out my threat. I hoped that when my father saw my lack of progress in school, he would have to let me pursue the happiness I dreamed of. I do not know whether my calculation would have been correct or not. The only certainty was my obvious failure in school. Anything else I learned was something I thought I would use later as a painter. Whatever I thought was not connected to painting, or whatever failed to interest me, I sabotaged. My report cards from that point on were always in extremes. Next to good and excellent rankings were passing and below passing. By far my best performances were in geography, and particularly in world history. Those were my two favourite subjects. When I look back now, so many years later, I see two facts that are especially significant. First, I became a nationalist. Second, I learned to understand the meaning of history. Old Austria was a national state that consisted of many states. At that time, someone who was a subject of the German Reich could not grasp what this fact meant to their daily life. After the Great March of Triumph by the Army of Heroes in the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans of the Reich had gradually become separated from German elements elsewhere. They did not understand the value, or they were no longer aware of the value in it. The German Austrians were too easily confused, and as a result the imperial dynasty decayed along with the otherwise sound and healthy people. They did not understand that if the Germans had not been the best blood, they would never have had the ability to impress their character on a state of 52 million Austrians. The mistaken idea took root, especially in Germany, that Austria was a German state. This was nonsense, and the result had grave consequences. But it was still a brilliant tribute to the 10 million Germans in Ostmark, the Eastern Mark or Eastern Borderlands, Austria, because their small presence was perceived as a total ownership by distant Germans. Very few in the German Reich realized there was a constant struggle to preserve the German language, German schools and German character in Austria. Today, this sad state of affairs has been forced upon millions of our people who dream of a common fatherland while they sit under a foreign thumb and long to preserve the sacred mother tongue. Finally, people are beginning to realize what it means to fight for one's nationality. And now, perhaps, a few here and there can appreciate the greatness of the German population in Ostmark,
the Eastern Mark, or Eastern Borderlands,
which, through its own resources, shielded the Reich on the east for centuries, then waged an exhausting guerrilla war to maintain the German language frontier in an age when the Reich cared for colonies, but not for its own flesh and blood. As in any battle, there are three groups in the struggle for our language in Old Austria: the fighters, the lukewarm, and the traitors. The sorting process begins in school. The most remarkable thing about a language battle